We have a few remarks before we begin, and I have been asked to read a statement by the university. It is concerning the free expression at Princeton. Quote, "Before we begin today's program, it is important to underscore Princeton's free expression values. Members of the Princeton community and visitors have broad freedom to express themselves in a manner consistent with the university's policies. At the same time, university policies prohibit conduct that, among other things, disrupt university operations and activities. To be clear, any individuals who disrupt this event are in violation of university policy, subject to disciplinary action, and will be asked to leave the premises immediately. If they do not leave immediately, they will be considered a defiant trespasser under New Jersey criminal law and subject to arrest." End quote. Don't do that. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background here about PFS, who we are, what we do, and why it's important. And again, we know you have a lot of choices in where you could be doing your programming today, so thanks for being here. We do have two of our founders in the room today. If they would raise their hands or stand, they're not going to like that I'm doing this. Ed Yingling and Stuart Taylor, class of 1970 grads. Give them a round of applause. We wouldn't be here without them. We are your voice at Princeton. We are fighting for free speech at Princeton and beyond. Not only free speech, but academic freedom, open inquiry, civil discourse, healthy debate, viewpoint diversity, things of that nature. These two gentlemen founded PFS in late 2000, and in the early days, it wasn't quite Steve Jobs in the garage with one computer, but sort of like that. They had strong backgrounds in journalism and advocacy, but really not a lot of organizational know-how, building a website, hiring staff, things like that. So in the early days, it was Stuart and Ed and some friends and supporters, and they got going in sort of a grassroots effort and movement here. They were motivated by a couple of particular campus controversies. That's how PFS was formed in its early days, and we've since expanded on being a thought leadership voice on other happenings and occurrences that have come onto campus since then. But there's larger issues. There's issues at Princeton. There's larger issues in academia and higher education, and they were motivated by all of those, and that's how PFS got started. They had initially partnered, again, like I said, with some friends and early financial supporters, brave students and faculty. John Londregan is one of the faculty members here who'll be moderating and discussing today. The Princeton Open Campus Coalition is a student group of brave students who wanted to speak out on free speech and other related issues. So really, it was just very grassroots from the beginning. We, in 2022, hired our first full-time paid employee. I am the second full-time paid employee, so been slow going, but really expanded a lot since then. Ed also was the first co-founder of AFSA, which is the Alumni Free Speech Alliance. Unbeknownst to them at the time, there was other alumni groups just like us who had organized in support of their campuses. And so AFSA now has about 30 alumni groups all around the country who are mobilizing alumni in the same ways that we here at PFS are. Why does this matter? Why is this important? Why are we here? Why are we fighting for this? Princeton has strayed tremendously from its core values. If you're familiar with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE is the acronym, they have a college free speech ranking. They rank universities every year on their free speech tendencies and policies. Do you restrict or promote free speech, things of that nature. Princeton currently ranks 223 out of 251. So I was not a math major, but I know that's not great. We also do a student survey annually. We actually just released our third annual survey earlier this week, and we found, there's a number of important findings. I won't read all of them to you, but importantly, 50 to 60% of students are self-censoring. They don't feel comfortable expressing and talking about their viewpoints and different viewpoint diversity points on campus here and things of that nature. A large number of students, we also found, understand what freedom of speech is in theory, but not really in practice. Like, what does this mean practically? How is it applied on a day-to-day basis? So what that tells us is there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of education still that needs to be happening. And we are here to change that with support from folks like you. We do that in a couple of ways. We are tremendous content producers. If you go to our website, If you want to actually get out your smartphones now, just take a picture or just scan the QR code. That'll take you right to our website. There's also a form there if you're so inclined to get involved with us a little bit more. We have an email list that goes out once a week, and we talk about Princeton free speech issues and beyond as well, but we don't spam you, don't sell your list, anything like that, but we just really want to keep you and alumni informed. So we have over 900 articles, free speech-related articles on our website. In 2024, we had about 1,400 people, primarily alumni, on our email list, so just last year. And through the marketing magic, I'll say, we've now grown that list and mobilized over 8,000 alumni on our email list. We'd love to add you to that list. Again, it's just a weekly newsletter that comes out, so feel free to scan the code and get involved with us in that way. And we are really looking to grow that list tremendously. We're looking to mobilize more and more alumni as far as getting behind our efforts, because if not you, who? Who else is going to be involved? Who else is going to help us mobilize change, if not the alumni? You have a very unique perspective and influence voice onto the Princeton administration. And again, we just really believe that substantial alumni voices on policy will help us make inroads and change within the administration. So that's why we're here today. You can help us shape the future. You can help us support student events. We fund events that promote healthy discourse, open dialogue, and debate. We support faculty, students, and staff, mobilize alumni. We host events throughout the country. If you are involved in your own alumni chapter in your particular city, you could get involved with us in that way. So really no shortage of ways to be involved with PFS. So we really would love you to get involved. If I haven't made that clear already, I'm just going to say it one more time. Get involved with us. We need you. We can't do this alone. We're a small staff, 2 paid full-time. We have our 4 exec members, 5 exec members, 3 of which are here today, Leslie, Spencer, Stuart, and Ed. They're a team of Princeton alum volunteers, and really they're the driving force behind this. And so we're just very grateful that you are here today. Thanks for listening to my spiel. And at this time, I'm going to bring up Leslie Spencer, who will introduce our speakers today.
Thank you, Angela. Welcome, everybody. Now I'm going to turn to our featured guest for today, John Tomasi, president of Heterodox Academy, and his discussion partner, Princeton professor John Londregan. The discussion today is entitled Open Inquiry, a New Path Forward. The topic is timely because it is not an exaggeration to say that there has been a real cratering of trust in higher education in recent years. Why has it happened, and what can be done will no doubt be explored today. I'm delighted that Princeton's John Londregan has joined John Tomasi today. John Londregan received his PhD from Princeton in 1988 and has since 2001 been a professor of politics and international affairs here. He is a specialist in the development and application of statistical methods in political science and has specialized in Chilean legislative and electoral politics since the transition from Pinochet's dictatorship to democracy. Directly relevant to today, Professor Londregan teaches a course here called The Politics of Higher Education, Competing Visions of the University. He is also a member of the recently established Princeton Council on Academic Freedom. It is a faculty group founded just last year with a named membership of 70 Princeton professors. Like its equivalent at Harvard and Yale and other elite universities, it is devoted to fostering academic freedom and intellectual pluralism on campus. Our featured guest for today is John Tomasi, president of Heterodox Academy. He has followed an unusual path in academia. He's a political philosopher who earned his graduate degrees at Oxford. He has held teaching and research positions at Princeton, Stanford, and Harvard, and for many years he held a chair at Brown University where he was a professor of natural theology. He has published widely, including books by Princeton University Press. In January of 2022, Professor Tomasi left his very comfortable position at Brown to become the first president of Heterodox Academy, based in New York. He took the helm of what was basically a startup with an uncertain future, and HXA has become the leading nonpartisan membership organization for faculty, staff, and grad students who want to ensure that our universities are, quote unquote, places where intellectual curiosity thrives. For those looking closely at the threats to free speech, and I'm sure many in this room are among us, academic freedom, pluralism of thought, open discourse in higher ed, HXA now stands out as among the most dynamic institutions in this country. Its membership of mostly faculty, but also graduate students and staff, numbers 7,600, up from 5,000 just 2 years ago. The membership derives from 1,800 campuses and other higher ed institutions across the globe. And most important, really, HXA truly does walk the walk on nonpartisanship. So to tee this up, I want to quote John briefly from a recent Heterodox Out Loud podcast, one of the many things they do, an excellent podcast. I want to quote him because I think the language that he uses is illuminating and useful. He is contrasting the remarkable expansion of diversity of people at universities over the last several decades with the dramatic decline in ideological diversity in these institutions. And he points out alumni reaction. Quote, "A lot of people who come to these issues, especially alumni, are looking at how things have changed, looking at some of the ideas coming out of universities, ideas that have caused problems in society recently. They see a lack of ideological diversity at their institutions, and they just get angry. It seems unfair, and for understandable reasons. Yet, we must recognize," he continues, "it is not just a question of fairness. It is the question of what are we trying to do at universities at all? If you close up whole patterns of premises and assumptions and whole ways to understand the world, and we think we are going to get to a truth in any kind of a lively way, we're just fooling ourselves. That is the deeper point," unquote. At PFS, we look closely at what has happened and why, both at Princeton and nationally. If there are topics not being considered and questions not being asked, if there are students afraid to speak up in large numbers, as our Princetonians for Free Speech annual student surveys clearly show, and if there are professors afraid to teach freely and in a lively way, these developments point to the question of what universities are here to do at all. And now, in this moment, these internal failures, these threats to free speech and academic freedom that have existed unchecked on college campuses for some time now in this moment, they are being met by real and potentially existential threats from without. John is going to start with a short talk, and then they are going to have a conversation. John, feel free to come up here if you'd like.
Hello. Thanks for coming. Thanks for caring about these issues. Thanks for caring about Princeton. I'll say some things about what it means to care, and I'll probably talk for just 10, 15, who knows, 20 minutes, so that John and I can have a conversation, and then we can all have conversation together as well. Just before I begin, as Leslie mentioned, I'm the president of Heterodox Academy after being an academic for a while, most of my life. And just quickly about HXA, so we're a group of mainly professors all around the world who care about open inquiry. We're on a lot of different campuses. We're in a bunch of different countries. We're mainly in the US and in Canada. We're growing fast in Canada for a variety of reasons. What I wanted to show you is this slide, probably maybe the most important slide about HXA. I kind of wish that this is the HXA way. It's a way of trying being professors and a way of being students that we try to encourage on campuses. Make your case with evidence. Be intellectually charitable. Right? It's easy to see what's wrong in people's views. It's more interesting sometimes to see what's good in them. Be intellectually humble. Not a trait associated with professors, I'm aware. But nonetheless, I think the really greatest professors, the greatest researchers who I know and respect the most, are the ones who, even when they have a dogmatic view on a certain approach to a problem, they're always pushing themselves to make it better because they know it's not good enough. That's what humility means in an academic setting, in my view. Be constructive, try to build, not just tear things down. And I like the last one the most, though it's the most cryptic. Be yourself. I think what that means is that every one of us has a story, a life that we've led, that leads us to believe the things that we believe. If we're aware of that about ourselves, we may have more perspective on our own biases and shortcomings. It also may give us the grace to think about other people and their views, realizing that they came from a different place than us. By definition, they lived a different life. So that's the HXA way. I kind of wish that Princeton, instead of reading the statement about how they're going to punish you if you disrupt the speaker, would read that to you instead. But anyway, that's out of my hands. I also want to just introduce my executive director, Michael Regnier, in the third row, class of 2002, Princeton. He's wearing not as much regalia as I hoped he would wear, but he's wearing at least something that's visibly orange and black. Michael, HXA has grown a lot in a variety of ways since I joined it 3 years ago. And Michael's been like my thought partner and my driving force through all of it. So I just want you to be aware that Princeton is like powering what HXA has been doing, and Michael's the reason why. So I'm just going to say a few things. I'm going to give an idea. I want to share an idea with you that I've been working on, and let me just tell you what I'm thinking. So how do you think about it? I want to suggest a certain view of our current struggles, and we'll define the current struggles more carefully in the conversation that John and I will be having. But I want to just describe our current troubles in light of a certain perspective on what a university is at its best. And I'm thinking about the idea that a university is something like a garden for curiosity, a special place, out of time, out of politics, or at least separated from time and separated from politics. If you think about Plato's Academy, the idea about there being a grove outside the city, away from the polis, importantly away from the ordinary run of politics, also away from oikos, household, things, economic things, a place where people go just for a little while to do this special thing of learning and thinking. And if we think about a university as being a kind of garden for curiosity, I suppose there are disciplines. The disciplines are like ancient trees, growing, branching, always reaching for the sky and spreading out in new ways. Some branches dying and dropping off, but it grows and moves. The students are I like thinking of as like flowers, quadrennials perhaps, there's such a thing. So they're here for 4 years just for a little while to do this thing they need to do. The administrators, the president, the professors especially, are like gardeners. They tend to the trees. They also tend to the flowers, hopefully. They care about these things underfoot too. And the garden is this, importantly, the garden has a wall around it, a certain kind of wall, the nature of which I think is importantly contested. And it's one of the central questions, I think, underneath many of our current debates is to ask, what's the appropriate nature of that boundary wall around the garden? How porous, how military, what's that wall like? But the idea that the university is something like a garden for curiosity, separated from the ordinary run of life, a place where people go, most students go just for a little while, 4 years before they're transplanted outside to the real world, but some of us spend a lot of our times hanging around this garden for longer. I want to explore that idea a little bit because there is disquiet in the garden. There is enormous disquiet in the garden. And I don't just mean the disquiet that comes from people threatening to turn off the water. That's been happening in the last few months dramatically, and we can talk about that, certainly. I want to talk about a deeper form of disquiet in the garden, a form of disquiet that I think sort of it may have led to the conditions, contributed to the conditions that moved us towards people who wanted to turn the water off to the garden. And what are those conditions? Well, we can describe the disquiet in the garden of curiosity, the disquiet on our campuses, in one of two different ways. The most obvious way to think about the disquiet, the most, I think, familiar way, is what I think of as like the battlefield view. On the battlefield view of the garden of curiosity, on the battlefield view of our current universities, there are basically a conflict going on between two groups within the garden. Some are the defenders of truth. They think that what the university is for is the pursuit of truth by itself. The others think that something like that garden wall should be softer and more permeable. They defend something like social justice as the important mission of the university, or as one of the important missions of the university. And from the battlefield perspective, people with these two different views of what the university is, these two different views of the telos of the university, as my friend and colleague John Haidt calls it, they're at war about that question, what the university should be like. Let me just say that, oh, I'm sorry. Let me just say that I'm familiar with that perspective, the battlefield perspective. I taught at Brown for 27 years. I was considered a warrior on one of the sides, the truth side mainly. I was never very comfortable with that description of what I was about and trying to do. But that perspective that the battlefield is something like a battle between these two different intractable positions, that's a familiar one to me, and I think perhaps to many of you. What I want to suggest is that there's a second way to think about the disquiet in the garden, and it's a way that I prefer. If we go up a little bit and look down on the garden and add and permit ourselves a smidging of grace about our own positions and the positions of people who don't see the world like us. That is, if we remember the last bit, number 5, be yourself, and just filled out in the way that I described before. So if you zoom up, if you go up and then look down on the garden, we might see things a little bit differently. We might see that we're doing, that from the higher perspective, we're not simply fighting. In many ways, we're all suffering together on campuses. We're suffering because, perhaps, we're all unwitting players in a great unfolding drama of creation. No universities, so for the past 50 years, universities have started to become inclusive for the first time. It's just really important to recognize how recent this drive towards inclusion is at our universities. The last Ivy League school began graduating women only in 1987. That's the year I graduated from college. To me, it seems like yesterday. That's a recent accomplishment, that most obvious form of inclusion. Other forms of inclusion for Jewish students that have historically been persecuted and denied admissions at elite schools. Muslim students only began arriving on campuses in any significant numbers very recently. There's a whole variety of different kinds of grouping, socioeconomic groups that weren't allowed into campus before. They started using SAT tests. This idea of inclusion is a brand new thing from an historian's perspective. And it's no surprise that we're making a mess of it. It's important to see that no university system of the past ever attempted inclusion on this kind of scale that we're trying to do it on. Bologna didn't do it, Oxford didn't do it, Cambridge didn't do it, Harvard didn't do it. If you go to the start of the 20th century, the great Germanic research universities, Hopkins, Chicago, Stanford, none of them did it. They all were searching for truth, and they did some remarkable things. They were incredible institutions in every way. They were, in many ways, they're remarkable flowers of human civilization. But because they excluded so many people, because they excluded so many participants, they failed by their own standards. They kept people out they needed in to do this important thing of understanding our world better. So what I want to suggest is that we're now trying to do inclusion, and not surprisingly, being humans, we've been making a mess of it. There's a whole variety of examples I could give. You know some of them, some of the things that have happened on the Princeton campus that brings some of you to this hall today, that brings you to the organization, the PFS, concerned about some of these outrages that have happened. But again, from the perspective I'm suggesting, we're trying to be aware that maybe we're doing something together, fumbling, as it were, to make things better. And we're going to think together now, as part of the conversation, about what we can do, what roles we might play. I'll just conclude by saying 4 quick things about how I think actors might want to improve our behavior, all of us, to help universities give birth, because we're in this struggling period, to give birth to something that the world has never seen. To give birth to something like a truly inclusive university that's committed to searching for truth together. So that's an ideal that's out there in front of us in the future that we're reaching toward. It's a more powerful ideal than any university system in the past has ever aspired to. And it's a difficult ideal to achieve. And so again, we should be aware of that and have some humility and some charity for the fumbling efforts people are making around us who are part of it. And my suggestion from that perspective, I'll make 4 suggestions regarding first the presidents of universities, including Princeton's president. Presidents should recognize that fighting for inclusion is not the same thing as creating an activist university. There's a distinction between being committed to inclusion for the sake of epistemic truth-seeking and turning a university into a reflection of one's own political beliefs. The university is about pluralism fundamentally, and presidents need to know that. That's the pathway. Pluralism is the pathway that leads them towards inclusion and away from activism. Professors, my friends, professors, we need to be aware and be willing to say courageously that identity does not automatically confer authority. Reasons matter. Make your case with evidence, no matter what your identity is. That's an ideal that's important. What's more, professors need to be aware that even as we get more sophisticated in our understandings of the nature of truth and knowledge, as we adopt more subtle and sophisticated conceptions of what it means to know something as a human, we should still be aware and committed to the idea that there is a reality out there worth knowing, and that disciplinary scholarship is one of our best paths of achieving that. That idea that there can be something worth knowing is fundamentally important that the gardeners should not forget. Students, there aren't none here, I see, unless they're older than they look. Students should be aware and be reminded and encouraged to see that the university is not just another venue for politics. There's something magic at a university. There's something sacred in this place. It's still in a process of becoming, but they should be part of that process of becoming with us rather than sideshows that move people off in the wrong way. And finally, the alums, you all, I guess I would say two things to you all, if I may. You don't know me, so please don't take this the wrong way. First, I'll say that the first one's easy. Some alums, as some of you know, at some universities have been making blackball lists of students who they won't hire and so forth. I would encourage alums to take a more positive, charitable, HXA way approach, and maybe start thinking about how do you create green lists to encourage students who, while on campus, practice the virtues like the ones up here. I think those virtues do well by one on campus, but they also do well by one in life and in business and throughout your whole life. And I think alums should be aware of that, and instead of hammering the students that they dislike, they should think about encouraging the kind of behaviors they really want. And the last bit, a little maybe a slightly more delicate bit, I would just say that alums always face a choice when they care about a place deeply. And I think that many of you do. That's why you're here this morning. And a choice alums face, though, is when they see things they don't like on campus and they come back to give their energy and time and even their money to it, they face a choice between, on the one hand, just wanting to poke the university in the eye. It's understandable. You might just want to do that. But at a certain point, you face a choice. Do you merely want to poke the place in the eye? Or do you actually want to get involved in a constructive way and help it? In my view, and here's the part I'll end with, maybe regrettably, in my view, alumni should be like principled parents to the presidents of the universities that they love. They shouldn't revert to being children themselves, though it's tempting and it's understandable why sometimes we do feel that way towards presidents and administrators. But I think that there's a more principled role of being something like a principled ally, something like a thoughtful parent that gives more power in the long run. And I'll stop with that, and John and I can talk together.
So again, thanks for fascinating remarks. And you talked early about the threat to the water supply for our garden.
Right.
And it sort of sitting in the middle of it, it looks as though the university has a mission that you spent most of your talk describing, I think, in eloquent detail. And then there are sort of competing visions of us out in the political world. And in the past, we've managed to stay outside of politics very successfully, for the most part. And now we've become embroiled in it. And it's as if there's a faction out there that says we should require the garden only to grow medicinal plants. And there's another faction that says we should make a parking lot here. Who needs a garden? And neither one of those is the gardener's agenda.
Right.
So we have the current administration that seems, at least at the moment, to want to either shut us down or dictate our curriculum or both somehow.
Right.
And turn us into, well, never mind. And then there's the other vision, sort of behind the Dear Friend letter about, okay, well, let's suspend due process for people who are charged with really unpopular offenses. Or let's implement political statements as part of the hiring process. And that's another kind of invasion, and it's been internalized, right? There are a lot of partisans of one process, not so much the other one. But they're both alien to the central mission of the university. How should we try to navigate those shoals?
I don't have an answer to that. I thought the other John might have the answer for me. But I think that there's something. What I was trying to do in my brief remarks was to give a sense for what we should be aiming to do, and to give us a little more understanding about, a more self-awareness of the struggle we're currently finding ourselves within. Because it's so emotional for people, understandably, because the stakes are high. So that's what I was trying to do with that suggestion, that we're suffering together in part because we're giving birth to something, this difficult process that, as I mentioned, the world has never seen before. And if you see that possibility, there's an excitement there, I think. The possibility of a truly inclusive university, searching for truth, using virtues like the HXA way. That's pretty enticing. I guess I would say regarding the water turner offers in the Trump administration, what I watched looking out across the country and talking to a lot of people on campuses across the US, including many campus leaders, I think there's a dividing going on now between two different reactions across the campus space, roughly, speaking very broadly. On one side are people who think that they read the poll in Gallup 3 years ago showing this, or 2 years ago, showing this dramatic decline in public trust in higher education. And this side says, well, this is all based on a misunderstanding. We just need to educate the public better about the truth about universities. So at many universities, at my university, Brown, for example, when the Trump campaign came in and started, when the Trump administration came in and started removing their funding, they changed the website. They removed the pictures of the diverse kids doing their diverse Brown kind of things. And they started showing people in white lab coats with goggles on doing serious science, thinking, oh, it's a misunderstanding. Once you understand what we really do here, you'll restore our funding and so on. That's one camp. The other camp, the one that we're more involved with at HXA, are presidents and leaders and faculty members who are trying to move things forward because they recognize their failings. And that's the first step towards progress, is recognizing your failings. If you recognize that Truth University failed by its own terms for thousands of years, maybe it's easier to recognize that social justice youth failed in its own terms too. It was exclusive, not inclusive of a whole variety of views. So that's one more step in that process, but it doesn't answer all the way down, obviously.
No, I mean it does. It leaves us with some big concerns about the practical way forward, where we want to oppose people who are trying to shut us down, but at the same time, we don't want that to drive us into the other camp, so that we simply become a captured entity that reflects the politics of the current administration.
Yeah, and that's really a danger with a politically homogeneous. So I mentioned the diversity of the university, this incredible accomplishment that's still in process over the past 50 years. But I think, as many of you are aware, there's been a cross-current there about diversity and inclusion. In the 1960s, the left-right ratio among the professoriate in the US was about 2 to 1. Today, depending on how you measure, it's about 18 to 1. Among junior faculty, it's about 40 to 1. So that's a strange phenomenon for a garden trying to encourage multiplicity of plants that can cross-pollinate in interesting ways and be full of surprises. The garden starts to look a little bit monochromatic, a little bit homogeneous, despite all its diversity. We're feeling diversity in other ways too, if we do balkanization rather than real integration into discussions. But that's a major, major issue. Michael Regnier and I were at a talk at a conference last week at Johns Hopkins, and we heard this remarkable address by their president, Ron Daniels, talking about ideological diversity and the failings of the university on that dimension, with an openness and with a kind of sincerity to make things better that I think I've never heard before from a university president. Now, is that because they're turning the water off on Johns Hopkins? They are turning the water off on Johns Hopkins. But I don't know that's the only reason why he sees this now. And that gives me hope, the idea that some university leaders are stepping forth to say, well, let's honestly be restless rather than just arrogant. Let's honestly want our universities to be better than they are. And that requires an honest reckoning about the mistakes we've made. I think the drift towards ideological uniformity is one of the greatest challenges facing our universities. We can overcome it and get better, but if we don't admit it, then really, where are we going to do? Where are we going to go?
So speaking of the mission of the university, I mean, it's a little odd. I always have a strange reaction when I'm reading an academic paper that was written in the early 40s. And I find myself wondering, well, wait a minute, what were you doing in the struggle to defend civilization? You were here in the ivory tower writing this interesting paper that I'm reading now. And yet, that's what made the ivory tower survive. And so there are some tensions inside of the university that you and I talked about the other day. There are competing traditions that are kind of written into the university's DNA. There's the Oxbridge tradition of the classic books, the great thinkers that comes out of ancient Greece, and we're forming values. And the ancient Greek idea was that we're training tomorrow's leaders, and we're still very much about that. And then there's another tradition, I'll call it the Humboldt tradition, coming out of the University of Berlin and other places in Germany, that's oriented towards research. The research in university, Johns Hopkins picked it up. Harvard sort of switched around to follow it not long after that. Princeton's picked it up. And the research university is it's kind of iconoclastic, but it's about progress. We're going to discover new things. We're producing new research. And those two goals are often in tension with each other. And the university has a challenge in balancing them. And then there's another set of goals. I mean, the theme of our discussion today is how Princeton can lead. We expect Princeton to lead. It's Princeton, for goodness sake. We're an elite. But we're in a world where we're trying to be more inclusive in a society that's traditionally an inclusive, very democratic society. And that's another tension. We're the elite includers, or we're the inclusive elite. Well, it's leadership, and leadership means something special, but somehow we have to square that circle by saying, well, we're producing good results for everyone. In a large inclusive society, we're going to have some eccentric or talented or special people, whatever it is that makes the university run. We're going to have some of those people. As a result of our being inclusive, we're going to bring them here and do special things. And that's our challenge. That's really part of our project. And we have to make that work. That's not easy. It's particularly not easy when we have people telling us which way to turn, how we're supposed to navigate, and they're using their political guidebook to tell us how to imagine we've got our political GPS on that's screaming at us. Turn right, turn left. And we're actually trying to find a new pathway. So how do we manage that?
Yeah, so I love that distinction between these two different ways of understanding what a university is. We might say a Greek conception, which is a conception focused on virtues and character, building leaders, building leadership, and something like the Germanic perspective, which is something about research and scholarship. What I'd add about that is that the research university conception, which was that's the conception underlying my idea about where we are and where we're going. That conception is fundamentally about pluralism. So that research idea, the motor or the fuel that we think conversations would lead us towards some new understanding, is that people see the world differently, and they share those different views with one another, and they get better through that kind of a process. But it's really worth noticing that's not the only virtue of the university. And John and I were talking earlier this week. Maybe you should say a bit about what happened to Germanic universities. Can you say something about it?
Yeah, I mean, sure. So, the good news about the German university is Alfred Wegener has this crazy idea of continental drift. The continents are moving. Okay, Alfred, you've been out on that Greenland ice pack a little too long.
And science says, follow the
There-
science, there's no such thing as that, there couldn't be.
There's motion. Do you have a mechanism for this?
It's the wackiest idea I've ever heard. He's obviously a kook.
Exactly. But he was allowed.
We should silence him because he's going to confuse the youth.
But he
He's
wasn't.
going to corrupt them. They might start falling off their continents.
But he wasn't. It was definitely an incontinent idea. but even bad puns are welcome in the Academy, or at least tolerated. And Wegener was tolerated, and 60 years later, the geologists finally figured out how it worked, and they realized he'd been right. And one of the reasons they figured out how it worked is that they heard of this crazy idea. And yeah, okay, the fossils from Antarctica do match. How did we get fossils in Antarctica anyway? And so they kept, it stuck in their craw and they kept at it, and it was productive. Well, then there's the fate of Emil Gumbel. So he's a famous statistician then at Heidelberg. He eventually wound up at Columbia. He has a probability distribution named after him. That's one of my criteria for greatness. Forget numbers and ILS. He had a probability distribution named for him. And one of his works was deaths on 500 deaths from right-wing activism. And he was talking about the violence that was happening in Germany in the 20s and the early 30s and writing about it. This did not make him popular. And a student group at Heidelberg, I believe they were called the Hitlerjugend, decided that his presence there made them uncomfortable, harder to learn. He should be expelled from campus. He didn't belong on campus. They just didn't feel safe learning in that environment with him around. And he and many other Jewish faculty and many other faculty really spoke up, found themselves on their way off of campus, and if they were lucky, they also got out of Germany. So the German Research University, which has all sorts of virtues, I mean, when you read about it for the first time and realize, oh, this came out of Berlin, this was Humboldt's idea, amazing, these were the good guys. But it had a certain value-free flavor to it. And what went on at the German universities later, in the later 30s and so forth, was Near Eastern studies started chasing all these insane Nazi ideas about ethnicity in the Middle East, and groups of people who were influencing other groups of people, and the role of special people to the Nazis. And it was all a great waste of time, and worse, it left this scar on academia where it was hard to talk about any kind of ethnocultural influence for a half a century afterwards because of the damage that was done. And so the German universities, for all their virtues of innovation, also had vulnerability in resisting bad values. And of course, we don't want to indoctrinate, but the Greek tradition is an indoctrination. But it's part of our heritage as the Academy, and it balances strangely with the research. The deeper you think about it, the more you realize there's a basic tension between that and our research activities. And there are various clever ways of squaring the circle. Introspection is another kind of research, but it's a tension.
Let me say something about that, and I'll tie it to Princeton. So there is this danger that historians of education talk about, and they use Germany, Germanic universities as an example, that given their formal commitment to truth-seeking, they were susceptible to being attacked and captured by a pernicious doctrine. And that's a widely known historical arc. What I think is really striking about it is that, in many ways, what the German universities lacked, I think, and the reason why they fell off, was that they didn't have a deep understanding of why the formal rules they had in place were there in the first place. And in many ways, they were like the students at Princeton, that this amazing study by the Princetonians, sponsored by the Princetonians for Freedom of Speech, sponsored this year, showing, as I think you mentioned, that many Princeton students formally can say, yes, I know the rules for free speech, I know what the penalties are, but they don't have an understanding about why those values are important. They haven't thought deeply about how controversial it is to say free speech should be protected at all costs, or at most all costs. They haven't thought about potential contradictions or tensions within that ideal. They were like, the Princeton students in that sense were like the college presidents, those 3 presidents who up in front of Congress and just beclowned themselves by reading out their legal rules about free speech and so on, because they're so hypocritical, among other. But they lack the deeper understandings. So if you have formal rules about pluralism and searching for truth, without a deep understanding of the tensions, challenges within that, you're vulnerable to just being swept away when a tide comes in. Students need that deeper understanding. It's one of the main contributions, in my view, of the PFS is that they really focus on these cultural issues on campus. I just want to go off just a small tangent here that I work with a lot of faculty groups, a lot of alumni groups across the country. And what I said about you all at the end of my remarks about be less like children and more like parents, it applies less to the Princeton alumni group than any alumni group that I know of. And I really mean that. There are alumni groups that I speak with in whom I had great hopes a few years ago they would come along with HXA and join us in our quest to make things better together, who really have gone off the childish end. They want to poke them in the eye, and that's what they do. But the Princeton alumni group is different. They're really leaders and stand out for taking a different approach, a really sophisticated approach, an approach that's data-driven, like the study I just described, and yet they also analyze the data to go to those deeper cultural questions. And what's it called, the Big Ten? The top 10. The top 10, like the top 10 ideals of the Princetonians for free speech. They have this fabulous connection to culture at every turn. They don't just say endorse institutional neutrality and that's all. They say endorse neutrality and talk about it with the students. Have them think about the weaknesses of neutrality. Think about the strengths of neutrality. Understand why you might want to do neutrality. Understand how it points to deep questions about the telos of the university. So I just want you to be aware, because many of you are part of this organization, but I just want you to be aware that this group here, this group of alums at Princeton, are really distinct. And in my view, Princeton needs alums to teach other alums how to be serious about reform. It's not easy to be a good parent to a president you don't agree with. Maybe it's a little arrogant for me to say you guys should be parents to the president. You're older than him, many of you. I think something like that is true. So, that wasn't a question, it was just sort of a side.
I didn't find that arrogant, but so one of the sort of staples of responses to the garden hose being cut off, one of the staple responses that I've seen coming out, especially of Harvard the last few weeks, is some enumeration of all of the important pecuniary benefits that are emerging from research that's done in university laboratories. And I mean, that's all right. The universities, the research that's being done at universities is being done there not because the government has been captured and is handing pork over to the university. It's because the universities are producing amazing results with relatively small inputs to further the cause of humanity. And there's a price tag on that, and you get drugs coming out of it and all kinds of other innovations that make our lives better every day. What's missing from that, what I haven't heard anybody doing, is talking about the value of the human capital that's produced at the universities. The value to all the students who come through our doors and walk out 4 years later here at Princeton, but also at lots of state and at other universities where they might not otherwise even be getting an education. And the economists will tell us that there's a kind of 80% premium, that your lifetime earnings go up by 80% as a result of attending a university. And there are various theories about that. But Nobel laureate David Card has a careful study that weighs the different explanations and says, no, actually, a lot of this is the accumulation of so-called human capital. That is, they're actually worth 80%. The people who come out of the university are actually worth 80% more, in the sense of being more productive and doing more important things. Now, there's a general, I think the political view has been that the universities are handing out sort of party favors, that it's just distribution. A handful of people get to say they're from this university, and that magically means you make more money. But that's not actually what the process is doing. And we haven't done in our discussions in the general public, we haven't done a good enough job of emphasizing not just the research side of what we do, but also the pedagogical and educational side of what we're doing here on campus. And I wonder if you could speculate about that, maybe even relate it back to the sort of German versus Greek roots of the university.
Yeah, I won't relate it back to those deep roots, but I will say that there's this really beautiful essay, I think 2 days ago, by Steve Pinker, some of you may have seen, called Harvard Derangement Syndrome. Did you see that? If you haven't seen it, you should really check it out. I think it's brilliant. Steve's an early Heterodox Academy member, and he and Jeff Flyer, who was the former dean of the medical school at Harvard, teamed up to build, they're both HXA members, and they teamed up to build the council at Harvard. But this beautiful piece, you can guess from the title, you can probably spin it out in your mind, that it's just this kind of madness, this obsession that you must kill Harvard at any cost for some unknown reason. And it's a fabulous piece, as I mentioned. What I would say about it, though, is that I think within Trump derangement syndrome, that kind of extremely vicious reaction to anything that Trump's for, you're automatically against, there's a certain kind of method to that madness, that form of madness. It's a way of undercutting and fighting back against Trump. I think something might be similarly true about the Harvard derangement syndrome. It is a derangement, it is a syndrome, but there's also some method in that madness, I think, that we should be aware of. There's a populist move that's afoot that this stuff is playing into, and universities need to do more, in my view, than simply showcase people with lab coats and give the dollars and cents. They need to give a deeper account of why a university matters. They need to explain why a quarter of the students at Harvard are from other countries and what that means to the US as a nation of immigrants tying to those ideals. So there's much more work to be done to explain the thick contributions and obligations of the universities to our society. Danielle Allen, also at Harvard, also at HXA, talks about a new contract being needed among us, and Michael Regnier from HXA has also written about this, the new kind of social contract we need on the part of universities. But denying that there's a problem, or taking the easy path to play on the audience's expected political orientation, to not take the problem seriously, but just to pile on and to lead the resistance on behalf of the university without recognizing one's own weaknesses as an institution, that's the saddest path. That's the path that needs some parenting, in my view. Some gentle parenting, but some firm parenting, by telling people the truth. And those truths should be data-driven. It's not hard to find data that would make most people realize there's something awry at Princeton and other places, for reasons like the ones I described before.
So I do want to open this up to our fabulous audience, but before we do that, I wonder if we could sort of go over the case for free speech and how we stick to that in this time of extreme polarization. You know, how should we view a faculty colleague who wears the MAGA hat into the faculty meeting and says, you know, you guys brought this on yourselves, too bad. How do we remind people about Wegener and about Edward Ross, who people probably, maybe some people don't know, but Edward Ross was an economist at Stanford 100 and some years ago, and he was a big silver advocate. And Jane Stanford, who was still involved in running the university, was on the gold side of that controversy and fired Ross for taking his pro-silver position. And it became part of the original case law.
She directed the president to fire him, right? And he resisted and for 3 years he resisted, and then he finally cracked.
So this was an infringement on free speech, and sure, he was talking about the events of the day, and he was taking a position that wasn't just unpopular with Jane Stanford, but also with a lot of other people. And it was seen as a betrayal of the university, and eventually there was case law that came out of it, but we would all, I think almost all of us in this room now, say that Ross was within his rights, even if he was a little silly, maybe a little silly about monetary policy, maybe not actually. But we would certainly think that it's okay to take an unpopular position, but how unpopular? What about the MAGA hat? Where do we draw the line between, this is my view about the issues of the day, or this is my research view, and here's where I stand on people cutting off your research grant just because I'm mad, or seemingly because I'm mad.
And I would say that the appropriate response for a university to such cases is always going to be some variation of the same response. And the same response that I have in mind is something like to deepen our understanding of the issues, to show the complexities that lie beneath the most seemingly obvious things. So out of that event at Stanford, many of you may know, came this beautiful report from the AAUP, report from 1915, describing what the role of the university is in a free society. They didn't know at that point what a university was, or what we think of a modern university as being. If someone gave a lot of money to the university, maybe they own the place. So it raised this question, who gets to control the university? And it's just a beautiful, beautiful essay exploring that question, talking about why there's a principle of faculty self-governance tied to academic freedom. Reading that report, imagine students at Princeton reading that report, thinking about their own university's place in the world from those set of eyes, that's a deep position to be in. This week was the last summit, so HXA has our offices are in New York City. We have something called the Siegel Center for Academic Pluralism, where you host visiting scholars, people on sabbatical for the year, and they come in and they spend a year with us working on these kinds of issues. And we do a weekly workshop called the Open Inquiry Workshop, and this Thursday was our final session of the year. And we read the Woodward Report, which is this famous report from Yale in 1972 about freedom of speech. And if you haven't read that report, I highly advise you to, but it's something that I think that would be fantastic in response to the MAGA hat question, fantastic kind of thing to have Princeton students read when they arrive here. Because the Woodward Report has a strong defense of free speech signed on by the whole committee, but then it also included a dissenting view from a graduate student that was almost as long as the report itself. And the dissenting view, this is 1972, the dissenting view picks up on a lot of the then cutting-edge critiques of free speech by Marcuse, for example, stuff in 1968, the postscript to repressive tolerance. So in that report, they give a defense of free speech in a kind of simple-minded but wonderful way. Sorry, not simple, a straightforward way. Let me get the right word. In an unqualified way. And then they qualify it in this really clever way of letting someone attack that view. And if you read the critique, which I hadn't read it for a couple of years, we read it, I was reading it Wednesday night before the workshop. I was like, wow, this critique is so strong, it could really kind of blow away the whole report. And the guy who wrote we were Googling the guy who wrote it, he was a student at the time. We Googled him, he's a country lawyer in New Hampshire now, in his mid-70s. I want to call him next week, tell him how incredible I think, what a contribution he did. But that is the answer, I think, to the MAG hat question. It's the question, the responses should always be some version of, let's deepen this. Let's embrace the complexity. Let's share it with you. And then we can see what our principles are and why we have them. So we don't just say, read the statement, don't disrupt the speaker. We understand something about why and when one disrupts, and what it means to make that choice, to cross that line. And that's where people should, that's where we should be delivering people to a plane of something like equality with us, all of us together, as part of a community trying to learn together. Maybe we should do that now.
Yeah, exactly. I think we could continue this interesting dialogue for a long time, but let's amplify it and hear from other people.
Let's actually give a round of applause to both of these gentlemen first. Thank them for their time and expertise. I'm going to actually, we will do Q&A in just a moment, I promise, but I'm going to pass the microphone first to Stuart Taylor. He is one of our founders, and he is just going to share something quick, and then we'll be on our way for questions.
Thank you all. My privilege as Ed Yangling's co-founder is to ask a distinguished guest who I think is here, Anne-Marie Slaughter. Is she here? There you are. To ask the first question. Her stellar CV includes 7 years as Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton and serving as Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State from 2009 to 2011. And I think you're better qualified than I am to ask these distinguished scholars the first question, so I'd appreciate it if you could do that.
You can give the mic to Matthew Stewart. Oh, right in front of you. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you. I think in this setting, on these days, I'd say I'm the daughter of the class of 53, I'm the class of 80, I'm the sister of a brother and sister-in-law in 83, and the mother of 23. And I say that because I do believe that Princeton stands for something really special, and that we have extraordinary bonds as Princetonians that other universities don't have. I've been to several others as well. And I always say that because if you're willing to make yourself as ridiculous as we are over these 3 days, it is a particular kind of bond. And I came to listen and to learn, and much of what John said I deeply agree with, and people like John Haidt and Danielle Allen are colleagues and friends. My question is really whether there isn't a chance at this moment to find a third way forward, in the sense that as much as we need to debate within universities, and I agree that we do. I have 2 sons who went to the university, went to college in the last 5 years, and both of them self-censored. There's no question that particularly young men, but not just, are not saying what they think. I think that's often because the most militant voices in the room, on the right and the left, drive out the willingness to try to say, what about something that's more nuanced, that's more complex? So I absolutely think we do need to have those conversations within the university. I think Alan Garber does too. I definitely think Ron Daniel does. I think, you may not agree with me, that Chris Eisgruber did a better job than many at preserving that here, but I think here too, we definitely need change. At the same time, I really do think the universities are under real threat. I mean, I read Steven Pinker this morning. I've been talking to my friends at Harvard. I was on the Harvard faculty for 8 years and on the University of Chicago faculty for 4 years, which is a wonderful place for the kind of thing we're talking about. But that attack, which I don't really think is, in the end, designed to help us find our way forward as great American universities. I'm much more worried about the cost to the country and to knowledge as a result. I mean, just looking at what's going to happen. I was just at Oxford, and there are just massive increases in applications, and we're going to see that across Europe. We could see a reverse flow of what we saw in the 30s of the great academics who came here. We could see that certainly for students and some faculty. So my question is more, is there a way for the folks in this room and the folks that I probably hang out with more frequently to be able to come together to acknowledge, with the humility, John, that you referenced, our own errors and our own sort of inability to see past political division, but to come together and stand for freedom of speech and academic freedom and the rule of law against the attacks that I think we are now experiencing. And Danielle Allen and I and Sally Frank and Eddie Glaude on the left and Paul Haga and John Bellinger on the right wrote that letter in the Princeton Alumni Weekly to say, we disagree on all sorts of things and we think the right and the left have violated freedom of speech, but we also think we want to stand for it now. And it's very hard to find a third way when you're alone, and you don't want to go over to the other side, but you don't really agree with yours. I hope this is a moment, not just for Princetonians, although I think we should lead the way, but for people across the country to say, we're going to do a better job of really debating and discussing with each other, but we're also going to stand for our collective love of our universities. I'm not sure that's a question as much of a speech, but I know you can both respond.
I mean, I'll just say that, just to underscore one of the points you made, this idea about stopping graduate students, preventing Harvard from having graduate students, or having students coming from abroad, it's important to know how just devastating that would be if that were followed through on. These are long-term cultures of learning and study And if you tear out students from programs, it's devastating for research and devastating for the There's something existential about it. It's not just a matter of money, that's obviously fundamental too. There's something about the culture and the fabric of study and learning that's being attacked directly. I guess what I would add is that I mentioned that beautiful 1915 statement by the AAUP describing academic freedom and who owns the university. They say all of us own the university together. It's a public trust. In that essay, they say that professors should be given the ability to govern themselves, and universities should be allowed this special degree of autonomy within a free society to govern themselves, because they're the only ones with the expertise to know what should be taught and who should be doing the teaching. But that report also says that, very presciently, that if universities don't handle that responsibility well, don't discharge that responsibility carefully, others will come in and do the job for them. And the people who will come in and do the job for them will do it in a hand-handed way, because they don't understand universities and don't even like universities. That's where we are now. And the AAUP statement describes that in a really sophisticated way. And I think the root of it, Emma, you mentioned the third rail, I think the third rail really is something like, what do we think about viewpoint diversity? I think it's at the base of a lot of these questions. Are we content to have a university where almost all the faculty and almost all the students are of one political ideology? It's not the only thing that matters in university. There's whole parts of university like plant biology where it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. What do we think about that? What would it mean to discharge a responsibility in a democracy to be viewpoint diverse within a faculty, within the student body? What does it mean not to do that, or not to admit how deep of a failing that is? I think there's no third path forward, and think about that question together in a serious way. I actually don't think that anyone actually knows what viewpoint diversity should be. It's a pretty hard problem in a whole variety of ways. But to think there's not a problem there, or to go on as though Trump's the problem, that's a mistake. It's a misunderstanding, it seems to me. Trump's a huge problem, obviously, existential problem. But if we're going to get better, we need to think about ourselves and be honest about that. And that's where I would start.
So if I could just quickly follow up, I mean, I certainly agree about your statement that, in some sense, Trump is definitely a problem, but in some sense he's a symptom of something else. He didn't just come out of a vacuum. As for the brain drain that Anne-Marie mentions, it's already happening. In politics, we already saw a big fall off in admissions, and we were losing people to Oxford, and that's something we've never done before. And
sorry, he used to lose Oxford. He used to lose Oxford a lot. That was about 100 years ago.
Well, yes.
I need to say that.
In the memory of everyone with these chairs, we haven't lost to Oxford. I think the hypocrisy concern, right? That, okay, we're all going to get together now. Okay, now you're concerned about this. Fine, we're going to be accused of hypocrisy if we get together and choose a new path now. That's not a good reason not to do it. We should just take the sting and move forward. It's sort of like paying off the debts you've already run up. We're going to have to pay for the past, but that shouldn't keep us going further into debt. We should chart a path forward now. People can accuse us of hypocrisy, and time will tell. If we stick to it, the hypocrisy charge will start to fade, and people will take us more seriously. We have many more questions.
Matthew has the mic. We're going to use the microphone for questions. Bill is fine here. Please make it a question, not a comment, if you could be so kind to try and get everybody's questions in.
My question is in the form of a dilemma. Princeton was the second university to adopt the Chicago Statement on Freedom of Expression. That's commonly understood as having the university adopt the First Amendment law to apply to campus. Prominent in this law is the late 60s Warren Court opinion, Brandenburg versus Ohio, which set a high or low bar, depending upon your perspective, as to what falls within free speech, including hate speech. Does this mean that Princeton, to be faithful to the Statement of Freedom of Expression, needs to make the campus safe for hate speech?
Sure, I mean, I can wade in on some of that. I think in order to make the campus safe for counter hate speech, we have to let people speak their minds. That doesn't mean violating time, manner, and space regulations. It doesn't mean disrupting classrooms. It doesn't mean making physical threats against people that you've declared that you hate. It does mean that if we have an open environment for speech on this campus, that there will be lots of people who take care of the problem. The person who starts advocating hateful ideas will find that their classmates, their dorm mates, and pretty much everybody else, I'm not sure about the squirrels, but I'm rooting for them too, will come back and respond. That in this environment, hate speech will splutter out and die of its own inconsistencies. So, yeah, free speech means free speech.
Yeah, I offer up slogans such as globalize the intifada.
So there are lots of good responses to that one.
Yes.
One of which is, are you really, well, never mind, I won't start.
But I would add to that there's a skeletal structure of free speech doctrine that holds up the free exchange of ideas within a campus. But that skeletal structure given by the First Amendment doesn't put flesh on the bones that we need. The flesh on the bones comes from students and professors understanding why they have free speech on campus, understanding that they're here to do something precious together, something like exchange ideas so they can all learn from each other. And one of the extraordinary features about a university we were talking about at the workshop on Thursday was that there's a strange feature about campuses where student groups are often empowered to invite speakers to come to campus of their choice. And many of the most controversial speakers who come onto campuses, for example, at Berkeley a couple years ago, were invited by student groups. And I think it's a really interesting fact about university life that we do this thing, we empower students to invite people, but then we don't talk with them about what that right means, what responsibilities come with that. We don't discuss with them enough we don't point their attention to the fact when they arrive, they're going to be empowered by joining groups to invite people onto the campus to speak. And then tell them, well, what does that mean to have that responsibility? How should you do it? What are your standards? What are you trying to achieve in this place? So I just think that's sort of, the First Amendment, obviously it's the skeleton. Without that, everything collapses. It's a blob of it's a biological bag of blob. But with a skeleton, it's just a skeleton. You need to have reasons. You need to have something like care and concern for a place to decide what you bring in, who you bring in, when you bring them in, and how you move things forward. It's not to say there are times when bringing in a deliberation that sometimes is down and dirty appropriately. And in a university captured by one ideology, where the people who are in charge of deciding whether they're going to diversify or not on the ideological convention, if we keep refusing to do so, they may need some down and dirty deliberation to stir them from their slumbers. And when Yiannopoulos, the guy comes to Berkeley and causes the riots, and the whole country sees that, they start asking themselves questions, why is that happening there? Why is it a riot? What's going on at that place? And some of the things that have been going on, we'd rather that our fellow citizens not see. And that's a failing on our part, it seems to me.
Zach, I think, had a question. The blue jacket, Matthew.
We had a question back here for a while.
Oh.
No, that's good.
Oh, you got it all. Thank you. Yeah, I think the comment you made about Trump being a symptom, not the problem, is actually is a good one. And it seems that at the heart of a lot of this, because we all want a free market of ideas, and that's how you solve a lot of these problems, as you were arguing. And it seems like the faculty issue, we talk a lot about the students, but the faculty issue, to me, seems like the biggest issue. And by the stats, they were always liberal, but there's a good conservative side, and it just got more and more liberal. And if the stats are correct, that the young professors are even more liberal, you don't have a counteract. You don't have the counter arguments going back and forth in a lot of areas. So how do you expect the students to also see things the right way? And given tenure, the faculty issue seems, I don't know how it's solved, to get a much more conservative viewpoint. It doesn't have to be 50-50. You just have to have enough people who can make those arguments, and you have a free expression of ideas, and the right ideas will win over time. But if you don't, And it seems like we're still going that direction. That seems really problematic. And one other comment is, I would argue that the sciences will be a danger too.
So the question of what viewpoint diversity is or what it requires, as I mentioned, is a really difficult one and really interesting. I think it's probably not, the answer is probably nothing like equity in terms of the counting up people's ideological dispositions. The answer, I think, is someplace in the domain of we want to have enough viewpoint diversity within the faculty, say, that there are a range of ideological positions are kept open in a lively way. So in climate change, for example, there are disciplinary standards of evidence that determine what counts as a good argument and a bad argument for the climate model. But it should be the case on a good faculty, a great faculty at a great university, that if a person wants to put out a view out there about a cooler model or a hotter model, it'll get evaluated by the disciplinary standards, not by just shouting them down or shutting them down because they're doing the wrong thing. So too in international affairs. If everyone's at the same ideology and they're all liberal internationalists, which is wonderful, no one's really going to work on an American exceptionalist position. So that you can be considered in a lively way, not given a free pass, but being interrogated by disciplinary standards. That's what we're after with viewpoint diversity. So too with a public health crisis. If there's a consensus that masking and vaccines mandates is the appropriate thing to do by the healthcare professionals, that's fine, so long as the Great Barrington people can speak and be criticized not for being anti-American or racist or something, but because by disciplinary standards. So you want something like that, and what happens in a human culture when you don't have viewpoint diversity, those views can be caricatured in such ways that even otherwise intelligent people stop keeping them open in a lively way. And that's what's happening at university, I think, on a whole variety of issues I could name. So you need something in that space. What it is exactly, I don't know. It's not just the faculty, by the way. There's some interesting studies showing that there's implicit bias, ideological, in admissions for undergraduates, not surprisingly. And that's one of the things we also need to look at pretty closely, I think, especially at elite schools.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, actually my question was about admissions, because it seems, what do you think needs to shift? Because it seems like we've gotten to a place where there's almost preference for radical certainty and activism over humble curiosity. So how do we start to shift that in admissions, not just for Princeton, but broadly?
Yeah, that's like the hardest question. That to me is like the baseline question. And I do think that part of it is, part of the process I think requires that we imagine and state what we're trying to achieve, where we're trying to go. I think we don't think often enough about what the undiscovered country for the universities we love might look like. Like, what would it mean for Princeton to be all that Princeton could be? And if you think about the ideal for universities, which we often don't do, we're often just, no offense, really smug and really self-satisfied. But if you think about that undiscovered country, that's the way to start a conversation about longing for something different. Then comes our harder work about what steps do you take to make the move actually happen. But I think it begins with identifying a goal out there, unachieved so far, that you're clearly not measuring up to yet. But it's your goal, and therefore it's okay. And you can work on it together that way, perhaps.
I think that's a great question. And what should we do about admissions? I think there's a practical choice we could make, but it would be a costly one. And that would be to involve faculty in undergraduate admissions. You know, right now we have admissions professionals doing it, and they're trained, and that's great, and there are all sorts of good reasons why we want them there. But at the same time, the administrative mindset likes decisiveness, and it's going to, when it sees itself in the mirror in an application, it's happy. And academics thrive on the ambiguities of the research frontier and of deep reading of texts. And when we see ourselves in the mirror, well, we like that. But guess who's choosing our students? It's the administrators. And so if academics were, if we weren't just whining about, oh, look who the administrators sent us this time, and then trying to turn them into Princeton alumni, which by the way we're pretty good at. But if we were actually involved in the choice process, I think we'd get a different outcome. Not an outcome that lives on the spectrum that the political system is caring about right now. Should we be picking on this demographic or that demographic? It's we'd get something different than that. And it would be very costly because my colleagues and I have been pampered and told that we should live for our research and teaching is an inconvenience and service to the department is worse than that. And yet that's what we really should be doing. That would be a sea change, and it would be an expensive sea change right at the moment that the spigot's being turned off. But I still think it's the way we ought to go.
I'm skeptical. I prefer the alums to be involved more. I think they're more diverse and may bring in more divergent viewpoints.
Yep, Ed.
Now I'm going to yield to somebody, one of our guests. Last question. I had a comment.
Yeah, this would be the last question.
Thank you. One of the consequences of the withering of sort of academic right that you've talked about, I think, is that maybe the pipeline of people to fill those positions has also withered. And there are certainly are right-leaning opinions out there, but they don't necessarily have a commitment to academics and the academy. And in some cases, it seems to me that bringing in opinions that don't share the values of the academy might actually be a problem for the academy itself. And so, do you see that as an issue, and do you have any ideas about how to address that?
So the pipeline problem is a serious one, but it's an odd one for universities to hold up as a reason not to make change. Universities are in the business of changing things and creating new scholars. That's what we do, right? That's what I'm looking at. So it's a difficult question. But I think our first step is to recognize you've got a problem, and it's a serious problem. Discuss what that problem might be. Another little moment from the Ron Daniels talk last week that I was struck by. He went out of his way to talk about AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, as having some really important scholars there. And just hearing a college president refer to think tank scholars, especially a conservative think tank, as being really important scholars, that was a remarkable little tidbit. Again, it doesn't get us, 50 cents in a sandwich. It's not going to get us there, right? But it's a step in the right direction, I think. But I want to really emphasize that the pipeline problem, I think it's exactly the kind of problem universities want. We're the ones who can solve that problem if anybody can. It's our business.
Can I just make one comment? I'm sorry, I'm Ed Yingling, so I get to...
He's one of the co-founders. He gets to speak. Yeah, he's all right.
I want to comment on your good comment and question. And here I'm going to take a shot at Ice Gruber. So Ice Gruber is seen, I'm going to oversimplify this, Ice Gruber is generally seen around the country now, justifiably, by a lot of academics and presidents as the leader of, I call it Group A. And there was a letter signed, I don't know how many are signed it now, 600 leaders of universities. It's an open letter that said two things that are right. It said, laid out the importance of universities, and it laid out that the Trump attacks are in many cases illegal and go overboard. What it did not say is, we recognize we have problems and we need to work on it. That is really missing from that letter. There are some leading presidents who are in Group B, and A and B are a little bit in conflict behind the scenes. Vanderbilt, WashU, Stanford, Dartmouth. They didn't sign the letter. And the reason they didn't sign the letter is it didn't say, also, we recognize we have a problem and we're going to work to address it. And until the universities say those two things, the only thing the public's going to hear is Group A, and they don't admit that they have the problem. So there is a group kind of working to address it, but I think Ice Gruber's on the wrong side of that.
Thank you. If you want to hear more from Ed Yingling, sign up for our email newsletter. See, look, he just set that up so nicely for me. Let's give the gentleman a round of applause again.